America conducted exercises with Greece. The secret aim of the largest US exercise in Europe after World War II
Внимание!
had Britain's military tactics against Russia is implemented. The Crimean War of 1853 and 1856 was applying the tactic of sending soldiers. Which countries did the US lands persuade? Do Bulgaria and Romania allow this? 104 practitioners and Turkeyede Admiral. Military Memorandum and Coup Declaration, Montreux Debates, US Business. Will there be a war against Russia, against Ukraine? Yes, it will be out someday. With this accumulation, if Russia retreats and stops, Russia was defeated by Moscow. Europe, China and cozy Korea become neighbors. Where will Europe stand in possible Ukraine-Russia war? The news is that Europe will act in whose favor the war is going. Just like in Syria, they exist and disappear. Exist without Russia. When Russia appeared in Syria, they were destroyed by magician dust or ninja dust. The largest dispatch of troops and vehicles since the Second World War in Russia filled the entire border in this way. Which country will Russia invade after Ukraine? So what are the Turks doing? When we look at the history pages, it is noteworthy that Crimea is a Turkish land and is called the autonomous Crimean Turkish Khanate. The state name of the Turks, who lost the 1853 Crimean War in 1856, is the Ottoman Empire. Now Turkey is a rematch from Russia. Once. And will he come to the aid of the Turks he still cannot forget? Or is he thinking of working again for annexation? Let's get to the point now. Deep-rooted past, gangrenous problems, Russia-Ukraine relations. Despite having a common history, the tensions between Russia and Ukraine that started in the 20th century resulted in the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the occupation of some regions by pro-Russian militias within the Ukrainian territory. Established in the territory of today's Ukraine, Russia and Belarus, the Kievan Rus means common history for both Russians and Ukrainians. So much so that the Russians described Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, as the mother of all Russian cities. Despite the common historical background and their ethnic and religious affinities, the events between the two countries in the 20th century have led to military and political tensions that have persisted until today. What was seen between the two countries? The first tensions between Russia and its neighbor Ukraine began during the Soviet Union. Ukraine, which preserved its importance in the Soviet Union until 1991, became one of the important agenda items for Russia both militarily and economically after gaining its independence. Political developments in Ukraine, in particular, were directly or indirectly related to Russia. Ukrainians brought the events of the Soviet Union period to the agenda of the country with the withdrawal of pro-Russian politicians. That millions of Ukrainians died in the 1930s. Mass executions and famine led by Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin were declared Holodomor Victims Memorial Day in Ukraine. What is the Holodomor tragedy? The Holodomor tragedy is considered one of the most painful events in Ukrainian history. Millions of people on Ukrainian soil were starved to die by the Soviet regime in 1932 to 1933. According to the data of the Ukrainian National Memory Institute, approximately 4.5 million people, corresponding to 13% of the Ukrainian population, died in the tragedy as a result of the collectivism policy of Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Unforgettable pain in Ukraine, Holodomor. The Holodomor Victims' Day was declared on the last Saturday of November every year during the period of Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko in 2005 for the tragedy, which is referred to as Holodomor, which means starvation in Russian. The collapse of the Soviet Union. Towards the end of the so-called Cold War years, during the period of restructuring the economic and political system, perestroika, which was tried to be realized in the Soviet Union since the 1980s, nationalist movements in many countries started to rise. Ukraine was one of the countries where the nationalist wave rose. The country left the Soviet Union on August 24, 1991, and Leonid Kravchuk became the first president. Leonid Kravchuk, he ruled Ukraine for more than 10 years, sharing the Soviet legacy. The first crisis between the newly independent Ukraine and Russia occurred with regard to the navy stationed in the Black Sea. Ukraine was home to important technological infrastructure during the period of the Soviet Union. He acquired the ownership of some of them with the agreements reached later. Ukrainians were also claiming the Black Sea Fleet. In 1991, first the Ukrainian Parliament Verkhovnaya Rada and then the President Kravchuk decided that the fleet belonged to Ukraine. However, not long after these steps, Russian President Boris Yeltsin announced that the Black Sea Fleet belonged to his country. While the presidents of the two countries agreed on the joint management of the fleet on June 23, 1992, they decided to share it 3 years later. However, the tension between Russia and Ukraine, which has just gained its independence, is not over. The agreement in question was extended for 10 years in 2008. Downing of the Russian plane. The Russian Tupolev Tu-154 type aircraft, which took off from Israel in October 2001, crashed into the Black Sea when the Ukrainian missile launched during the exercise hit the Black Sea, and none of the 78 people survived. Ukraine officially did not take responsibility for the incident. This incident caused tension in the relations between the two countries. The last act of the crisis in Ukraine, Donbas. Orange Revolution. Demonstrations against pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine, later known as the Orange Revolution, also determined the fate of the country. For many years, the country would witness the conflict between pro-Russian and pro-Western circles. When the dates showed November 22, 2004, the people in Ukraine were at the polls. President Leonid Kuchma, who ruled the country with an iron fist for more than 10 years, did not run again because his term expired, but was supporting the candidacy of the then Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, known as pro-Russia. The parties were involved in the armed conflict when the Ukrainian-flagged patrol ship SKR-112 went to Odessa in June 1992. Protests against the administration took place in Independence Square of the capital Kiev. As pro-Western and nationalist circles in the country united around Viktor Yushchenko, it was announced that Yanukovych, known as pro-Russia, won the second round of the elections. However, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Independence Square in the protests that started with the allegations of fraud in the elections. As a result of the events with open support from the USA and the European Union, the public went to the polls again, and this time it was announced that the pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko won the elections. These events that took place in Ukraine were called the Orange Revolution. However, the leaders of the Orange Revolution, instead of addressing the corruption, compromised with the representatives of the old regime and engaged in tough struggles among themselves, which created disappointment in those who supported this revolution. The events known as the Second Maidan and that started exactly 1 year ago defeated the Orange leaders and took the presidency in 2010. While both revolutions found support mainly from the central and western Ukrainian populations, southern and eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian tendencies were stronger, approached these developments more distantly. Crimea's invasion. The pro-Western protests in Kiev, when the pro-Russian Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych announced that he would not sign the European Union Association Agreement in late 2013, caused the administration to overthrow. Immediately after this, unusual events started to take place in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, which is connected to Ukraine. In the streets and squares of Crimea, people in military uniforms and gun to hand were stalking the streets and squares without any sign of belonging. These gunmen, called Green Men, occupied public buildings and tried to take over the peninsula. One of the places occupied by pro-Russian armed groups was the Parliament building. Crimean Tatar Autonomous Republic of Ukraine editor, Turkic Tatars used language spoken in Turkey. The referendum, in which the Crimean Tatar National Assembly decided to boycott, was held on March 16, 2014. In the referendum under the control of Green Men, who put pressure on non-Russian people and caused thousands of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians to leave their homes in this process, it was announced that the decision was made to attach Crimea to Russia. 5 days after this decision, the Moscow administration held a ceremony for signing the signatures that will connect the Crimean Peninsula to Russia. After the annexation, Russia was in Crimea with its soldiers wearing coats of arms on the uniforms. In the new period, pressure on those who opposed the annexation of Crimea and defended the territorial integrity of Ukraine increased. The leader of the Crimean Tatar people, Mustafa Abdulsamil Kirimoglu, and some other Crimean Tatar National Assembly officials were banned from entering Crimea. The Crimean Tatar National Assembly, which represents the will of the Crimean Tatars, was included in the extremist organization and its activities were banned. Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, raided Crimean Tatars' homes, mosques and schools. Its parliament decided to hold a meeting on the 6th of March to decide the future of the peninsula. Should Crimea remain part of Ukraine or be attached to Russia? The referendum decision to be directed to the question came out. International organizations reacted to the referendum decision. Leaders stressed that the referendum decision in Crimea was illegitimate, against the constitution and international law. Although the United Nations Security Council convened 5 times to evaluate the developments in Ukraine and Crimea, its failure to take a step towards a solution reinforced the comments that the Council has become dysfunctional. Emerged in response to the rule of the seated Viktor Yanukovych. The first incidents broke out with the Yanukovych administration's announcement that it delayed signing the association agreement with the European Union. The harsh intervention of the police, on the other hand, poured into the streets much larger masses who reacted to Yanukovych for various reasons. Although there were no casualties in the first Maidan, more than 100 people died in the second Maidan. Later, Russia's intervention in Crimea and the conflicts that started with pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine and more than 4,000 people lost their lives, dragged the country into a war environment. Turned from the threshold. On the other hand, the fact that the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov, one of the most important ships of the Black Sea Fleet, could not be shared, increased the tensions again. Friendship agreements. Boris Yeltsin and Leonid Kuchma agreed that the Black Sea Fleet would remain in Crimea until 2017, which would bring the two countries to the brink of war, and signed the agreement between the two countries in 1997. With this agreement signed by the two presidents, Russia and Ukraine officially recognized each other's borders.
О, это они хорошо убирают 19-й. Если они уберут его раньше, очень даже хорошо будет. Закрыли. Закрыли форму.